Good afternoon. My name is Ken Feinstein. I am a associate professor and researcher at the Center for Research Creation in Digital Media at the School of Arts at Sunway University in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Today I'd like to give sort of an exploratory talk, asking questions and hopefully raising more questions than I can answer regarding the nature of experience and interaction in memory, in media, and how that relates to memory. So let's begin. Let's look at a context, and then I'll get into each one of these questions, a few questions individually, and raise more questions at the end, hopefully. So for the first, contextually, what is the relationship of memory and media? How does experience define memory, and how does media help create it? So so we need to think about what the relationship is to experience and memory, and then how does media sort of relate back to both of those and create a situation where they all have interplay with each other. Do we use memory as a way of preserving experiences of our past, or do we use memory as just a way of turning something into meaning, into symbols that we can create into a symbolic order where we can have meaning and understand things? That's what we need to think of. We want to think about that for a moment. I mean, we understand that, for the most part, I think we understand that memory is about recalling experience, where the latter, the idea of the symbols and meaning, is sort of deriving something from that, and there's this separation. And we need to talk about that a little bit. So how do different media define the way that we access and organize media? Or really, this may seem very simple, and we may not even think about that a lot. But going back to as long as we've had media, we've had this relationship of how we organize memory within media. Books, photo albums, home videos, social media. All of these things are devices that are used to take things, put information in different places, organize it, allow us to access it in different ways, allow it to be either maybe intellectual media in terms of rereading, memory in terms of rereading books, or photo albums, which may be more experiential and more emotional memory. How do we organize these things? And then from there, what I think is the main part of, I'm hoping that we get out here, is can we actually create a language that we can use to talk about this? Because I feel that in some ways the problems that we've had with dealing with some of this, and why it isn't talked about, I think, enough in developing media, either things like social media or even in things like interactive art, is because we don't have the right language for it. We kind of have things that indicate it a little bit, but we don't actually have a good language to get us to where we need to be. And today I'm going to use a couple of theorists and hopefully use some of their work to lead us towards maybe talking about this in a certain way. And hopefully you'll find this interesting and not a waste of your time. So, first question, what is the difference between interaction and experience? I mean, it may seem like a simple thing, but if you think about it, a lot of times we talk about interaction and we talk about experience as if they are the same thing. And they really are very, very fundamentally different, especially when we think about digital interaction. So that's why I wanted to sort of raise this as a question. We would like to think of them as the same thing, but they kind of have some very distinct differences. I mean, when we think about interaction, we're really especially like in games, in websites, and a lot of things, especially digital things, we tend to talk about, we have actions that are programmed in, that are done. They're built around, if you do this, then that. If you don't do this, then that. It's very much a cause and effect thing. It's a set of rules that brings us to different places, but it always is sort of based on this action-reaction, sort of command-response kind of way of understanding the world. Where, by contrast, when we talk about experience, we're talking about events that we incorporate into our psyche, that become things that form who we are, and that memories can be lodged with, experiences are lodged as memories, which different memories can be grouped together in different ways that have a form of significance to you. They aren't just things that are remembered in a linear fashion. Memory is not a timeline. Memory is really about how certain key things link experiences together. So this is the difference between action and impact. So interaction is more based on action. Experience is more based on impact. If we do a really great job at things, we may be able to bring the two together, but they aren't inherently linked. And this is why we tend to confuse communication with meaning and impact. With communication is about sending and receiving messages, and that may deal with meaning, but doesn't necessarily deal with impact. So we want to think that they're all sort of the same, and they can be linked together, and sometimes it can be hard to unpack them. But there are these things that are completely different. So, and there are some really great examples of this. So the difference is that one is contemplative and one is bringing us into sort of understanding ourselves and maybe being more self-reflective, and the other is reactive. And you can find that the difference between these things, a great example is when I play a game like Red Dead Redemption, I'm very engaged. It's very active and reactive, and I'm doing things, but I never identify with the character that I'm playing. I don't really think that I've experienced their world, where I can watch, I don't know, The Godfather, and I can feel very much engaged with those characters and feel that I've experienced their world, and things from that can have a larger impact on me later on in my life because of that identification with those characters, which I don't get in that active-reactive level. So from here, what I want to know is, so this is what I'm saying, we can have knowledge. I mean, you could say knowledge in terms of training, in terms of muscle memory kind of things, like learning what to do as a medic or learning how to do mind sweeping or things like that, which are taught through gaming, especially the military teaches some of this through gaming, can be taught to us through interactive tools. But if we want to talk about knowledge as gaining, being more than just muscle memory, and really be about understanding things on a different kind of level, can interactive works do this? Or is it only work as a happy accident? Or if we are able to program that in, are we only able to? Do we program that in by making the interaction less important and the meaning and the identification with what we see more important? Do we, what is that balance that's in there? Now, so let's look at the idea of knowledge. How are we going to define knowledge for the moment? I want to talk about two different levels of knowledge, and I think that for one of the best ways to do this is if we start off with Roland Barthes' work in the book Camera Lucida. And it's a pretty classic work at this point. I'm assuming that probably all of you are familiar with it. You've probably all read it many times. I know I've read it way too many times. And within there, he talks about what he calls the studium and the punctum. And the studium and the punctum, I think, fit into the sort of the formation of the argument that I'm trying to make here in a very nice way. So what do we mean by knowledge? This is our first question. So for Barth, when he talks about the studium, he's saying that there's knowledge, and knowledge is this is what we learn through culture, it's what we're taught from our parents, it's what we're taught by when we learn how to read and write, when we go to school, when we read certain books, when we're in the newspaper, when we decide that we're going to be a Democrat, a Republican, or whatever. That's all kind of learned things, and those are kind of things that we understand and we sort of incorporate into this thing that we call the studium, which is something that's kind of like you could see how that helps build an identity, but it's very much about programmed knowledge, and it's about putting things together that at the end of the day affect me and help define me in a way, but are outside of me. They never really touch the core of my psyche, as it were. What's interesting is we're talking about things. The studium is when we're talking about things that can be articulated. It's things that always tend to go back to being able to be verbalized. to a verbal kind of knowledge. That this idea of knowledge is not what happened to me when I fell out of a tree, but something that I've learned, something that I can articulate. So if we understand that as knowledge, then does this leave any room for the experiential as knowledge? Because we learn from experience all the time. Of course we do. We know this, but can we define this as, or would we define this as something, as what Roland Barthes referring to as the studium? Does this really make sense? Is this more personal knowledge that forms us as an individual as opposed to us as a entity within a society, entity within a political or economic culture? The studium makes me a professor, experience makes me Ken Feinstein, and that's the difference. So when we talk about the studium, does it give us enough room? Does knowledge as we understand it that way give us enough room to define Ken Feinstein as opposed to Associate Professor Ken Feinstein? And some of that starts to go into, when we start to get into what's the difference between me as a role and me as a person, is we start to need to talk about how memory is personal, but it is individual and personal, but it's also about a relationship of encountering otherness, which we'll get into. I want to get into this idea of otherness and that interaction with otherness a little bit further along. Next, let's go to the other way of defining these things, which is going to Marshall McLuhan, and we're all familiar with Marshall McLuhan. He uses hot and cold a lot. I find hot, and also sort of interchanges that with high and low, and high definition and low definition. And I just kind of feel that these days, with the way that media has developed and the way that we talk, I think that high and low definition makes more sense than hot and cold. I find that when I talk to people, they understand high and low a lot better than hot and cold. So that's why I want to go with high and low here. So one of these things when we talk about all this, and high and low is really interesting because it's partially about how much room is there for me to put myself into these things. So do we have a different way of defining media that's more based on enhancing identity instead of just what we see on a screen? Instead of just what we see on the screen, we could also say studium. So is there a way of defining media that's more based on personal experience and less on just filling out these roles? And there's a lot of stuff that's been written. It's kind of interesting how these things fluctuate, how we redefine ourselves in terms of memory and so on. McLuhan, he talked about hot and cold in relation to interaction. Where I think one of the problems is that we think of things that are engaging as hot in normal language, and we think of things that aren't engaging as cold in normal language. But for McLuhan, of course, it's the opposite. But he's thinking of media in terms of a relationship to interaction, which is about engagement. Roland Barthes with the Studium, he's talking about the Studium as what we've learned, and the punctum, I guess I didn't really say this, and I don't know why I didn't say that in there, and I apologize. That the punctum is about the thing that touches me. The punctum is the pierce, the thing that sort of goes into my soul, my psyche. It's the thing that is the reaction that's so individual that I can't share it with you without turning it into something that's almost a little bit more studium-like because you won't understand it. I think I'm running slow on time. So instead, I think we should need to recast this to high and low definition, because high definition is everything's there and there's very little room for me and there's very little room for experience, and low definition is where we can open up these things and we have room for experience and interaction to come together. So what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to ask again, what is this relationship? And this relationship, I think, is fundamentally built around a relationship to otherness, and that we define ourselves through the other. Otherness is the thing that is before us, and is a thing that we face in a way which is about experiencing something, seeing something without having to reduce it to meaning. It is when we encounter something as equal to us, as a way beyond language, something that goes beyond, like I said, when I identify with a character in a movie, when I see a family member, when I see my cat, when I see something that really turns into something that's much more of a personal experience. This is what we're talking about. And what I'm trying to say is that experience is always has embedded in it this encounter. That no matter how much I can learn something from it, the experiential is always about, it can be the studium and the punctum put together, but it's always about this sense of building life and building self and so on through the encounter with something that's beyond me that has effect on me. And interaction doesn't necessarily need or feel that it has to go that way. So what I'm saying is, do we need to, what I'm trying to get at is this idea that one of the things that helps, that really is fundamental to defining how we understand what we're talking about, is that if for something to truly be experiential, it needs to open up this relationship to otherness. That the other is fundamental to the idea of where we're going with. I'm about to run out of time, so I just want to, without going too much into the other, I want to say, well, where do we take this to other questions? We need to redefine these things as a way. Can we redefine high, low, punctum, studium as a way to getting into talking about the issues that I've just brought up? Do we understand the experiential? If we understand the experiential in media, can we understand how to create new media and new ways of thinking about things? Because I think fundamentally at the end of the day, we need to say, how does this allow us to develop new works? And does it clarify how forms of media that have power, and what do they do, and how can they be used and misused? In other words, what I'm saying is, when we look at something like Facebook, are they taking these things? And I would say that they are. They're taking things that we understand about this relationship to the experiential and that relationship to otherness, and it's fundamentally what drives things, and then they're turning it into something else. And if we're not aware of that, then we don't know how to fight against it. That's my last point here. So I'd like to thank you very much. I went a minute or so over time. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me.